France, 1944. The war is ending, but for some, the sentence is only beginning. Men are forcibly taken from their homes. There are no judges, no defenders, only a silent crowd and a firing squad awaiting the order. A second later, the gunshots. For years, the Milice Française hunted down and mercilessly executed their own compatriots. Now the resistance strikes back. In streets, squares, and basements, the hunt for traitors is swift and ruthless. No one forgets. No one forgives. Was it justice or vengeance, a legitimate punishment or an uncontrolled purge? When the occupation ended, another kind of war began. This is the story of the most relentless executions of the French resistance. The internal betrayal, the creation of the Milice Française, France, summer of 1940. After 6 weeks of combat, one of Europe's greatest military powers had fallen to the German forces. On June 22nd, in the Compiègne forest, the armistice was signed, dividing France in two: the northern zone under direct German occupation and the southern zone, administered from Vichy by the government of Marshal Philippe Pétain. In this scenario of defeat, the Milice Française was born, a key player in a fratricidal war where Frenchmen would hunt down other Frenchmen in the name of collaboration. This paramilitary force represented the most extreme form of collaborationism, surpassing even the ideological commitment of the Vichy regime itself. Pétain's government adopted collaboration as an official policy, independently implementing anti-Semitic measures, persecuting political opponents, and launching a national revolution aimed at replacing Republican values with an authoritarian order under the motto "Work, Family, Fatherland." This collaboration was not imposed by the Germans, but was a voluntary path, one that at times even anticipated the occupiers' demands. While the resistance was gradually organizing on January 30th, 1943, coinciding with the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the official creation of the Milice Française was announced. Though presented as a law enforcement force, its true purpose was to eradicate the resistance and deepen collaboration with the German occupiers. This symbolic date revealed the organization's true loyalties and ideological inspiration. The milice emerged as an evolution of the Service d'Ordre Légionnaire, formed in 1941. Pierre Laval, Vichy's prime minister, was officially its leader, but real power lay with Joseph Darnand, its founder and secretary-general. This duality reflected the complex relationship between Vichy's legal government and the more radical forces within the regime itself. Darnand, a decorated veteran of World War I, had drifted towards right-wing extremism during the interwar years. His anti-communism and ultranationalism led him to personally swear allegiance to Hitler and accept the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS, an extraordinary act of submission from a former French war hero. His trajectory exemplified the political radicalization many experienced during the interwar period, transitioning from traditional patriotism to fascism. Approximately 35,000 men joined its ranks, exposing the fractures within French society under occupation. The first group consisted of convinced fascists and ultranationalists who saw the 1940 defeat as the result of the Third Republic's decadence. For them, collaboration was an opportunity to regenerate France, eliminating what they considered corrupting foreign influences: Jews, communists, Freemasons, and Republicans. These ideologues formed the organization's hard core and occupied most leadership positions. A second group joined out of opportunism. In a war-torn country, the milice offered tangible advantages: better food rations, a steady salary, exemption from forced labor in Germany, and a position of power. The severe rationing made these benefits extraordinarily tempting for many in precarious situations. For these opportunists, ideology was secondary to the immediate material rewards of wearing the blue uniform. There were also those who joined under coercion or to protect their families, especially in areas where the milice exercised strong local control. The recruitment of common criminals, with promises of reduced sentences, added a brutal criminal element that would manifest in their operational methods. The organization had a hierarchical structure, with a core of permanent members, the Franc Garde, who lived in barracks and received intensive military training. Militiamen wore dark blue uniforms with berets and the gamma letter emblem, symbolizing their supposed mission of national renewal. This paramilitary force had its own ranking system, initiation ceremonies, and codes of conduct imitating both the traditional army and European fascist organizations. Their decisive advantage over the Germans was their deep knowledge of French society. While for the occupiers, France was a foreign country, the militiamen knew local customs, language, and could easily detect clandestine activities. An Allied intelligence report noted, "The milice represented a lethal threat to resistance networks due to their ability to identify signs of underground activity that would go unnoticed by foreign eyes." This capacity to interpret the social context made them extremely effective hunters. Their combat methods were both efficient and ruthless. Infiltration was their weapon of choice. Milice agents posed as sympathizers to penetrate underground networks. In Lyon, both a stronghold of the milice and the resistance, they successfully infiltrated major cells, indirectly contributing to the capture of Jean Moulin, de Gaulle's delegate tasked with unifying the resistance. At the same time, they built an informant network that reached all levels of society, creating an atmosphere where a careless word could mean death. This network thrived on both material incentives, extra rations, protection, money, and coercion or personal vendettas. The result was a society where the most intimate confidences could be fatal, and silence became a survival mechanism. Detainees faced brutal interrogations in makeshift detention centers across France. Former hotels, garages, or schools were transformed into torture sites, where methods such as systematic beatings, electric shocks, simulated drowning, mutilations, and sleep deprivation were used. Women also suffered sexual assaults. What was particularly disturbing was that these centers were run by Frenchmen against other Frenchmen, adding a dimension of betrayal that intensified the victim's trauma. The milice regularly carried out summary executions with the dual objective of eliminating opponents and instilling terror. Some executions were deliberately public, leaving bodies exposed with signs labeling them as terrorists or enemies of France. Others were carried out in secret, with gunshots to the back of the head in basements or open fields, followed by the concealment of the bodies. This combination of public terror and clandestine elimination created a widespread and paralyzing climate of fear. In retaliation for resistance actions, they participated in massacres against civilian populations. In Vassieux-en-Vercors, they collaborated with the SS in the execution of 73 civilians as revenge for resistance activity in the mountainous Vercors region. In Saint-Genis-Laval, they executed 34 political prisoners before the arrival of Allied forces, later attempting to incinerate the bodies to erase evidence. These collective reprisals aimed both to punish and to terrorize any community that sympathized with the resistance. As the war progressed and German defeat became inevitable, the milice's brutality intensified. Driven by fear of retribution after the liberation, it was a vicious cycle. The more violent their actions, the more certain the prospect of reprisals after the war, and the more they feared those reprisals, the more extreme their violence became in a desperate attempt to suppress any opposition. This spiral reached its peak after the assassination of propaganda minister Philippe Henriot by the resistance in June 1944. Known as the French Goebbels for his incendiary radio speeches, Henriot was a prominent figure in collaborationism. His death triggered a wave of executions of political prisoners by the milice, carried out as an act of direct vengeance. With the Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and the imminent collapse of the Vichy regime, the milice began to realize the severity of their situation. Some deserted, trying to blend into the civilian population, destroying uniforms and incriminating documents. Others fled to Germany, where some would join the Charlemagne division of the SS, composed of French volunteers. A third group attempted to escape to Spain via the Pyrenees. The most fanatical, however, remained at their posts until the end, whether out of ideological conviction or because they knew their level of involvement left them no hope of clemency. For these men who had chosen the path of active collaboration, the fate that awaited them after the liberation would be as relentless as the justice they had themselves administered during the dark years of the occupation. A war within the war, the ruthless struggle between the milice and the resistance. By 1943, the German occupation had entered a new phase. What had begun as a surrender and collaboration had evolved into an internal conflict, where Frenchmen fought against Frenchmen with extraordinary ferocity. The Milice Française had unleashed an undeclared civil war in the shadows of a captive nation. This fratricidal confrontation took on unique characteristics. While the Germans were perceived as identifiable invaders, the militians represented something more disturbing. The enemy within, the neighbor turned executioner. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred in a society where loyalties had been irreparably fractured. In many communities, people who had lived together for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a deadly conflict. In cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse, the milice launched a systematic campaign against resistance figures, opposition intellectuals, and anyone representing Republican values. The objective was twofold: to decapitate the organized opposition and to demonstrate that no one, regardless of their prestige or social standing, was beyond their reach. The case of Victor Basch dramatically illustrated this strategy. On January 10, 1944, this 85-year-old Jewish intellectual, honorary president of the League of Human Rights, was intercepted along with his wife Ilona on the outskirts of Lyon. Both elderly victims were executed on the spot by a milice squad. The choice of Basch was deliberate. He represented everything the collaborationists despised: Judaism, secular humanism, and the defense of Dreyfus. His murder sent an unequivocal message to French society. If a respected old man was not safe, no one was. Nighttime abductions became one of the most effective methods for instilling terror. Entire families were awakened by militians bursting into homes without warrants, dragging suspects away. These operations were indiscriminate. Men, women, and even teenagers were taken from their beds, often never to return. The sound of vehicles stopping at midnight became a source of panic in entire neighborhoods. A schoolteacher from Grenoble recalled, "They came at 3 in the morning, 6 men with blue armbands. They didn't let me get dressed. They took my husband in a different direction. I survived the interrogation, he did not." Experiences like this, multiplied by thousands, created a climate of permanent fear among civilians. Torture was systematically applied in makeshift centers across France. The milice transformed everyday spaces, hotels, schools, administrative buildings, into chambers of torment where human rights were completely suspended. Among the most common methods were the bathtub, where the prisoner's head was repeatedly submerged in water, the swallow, where detainees were suspended by their wrists, tied behind their backs, and elaborate forms of psychological torture, including mock executions and threats against family members. For many victims, the most disturbing aspect was not the physical suffering itself, but rather hearing the screams of other detainees, recognizing the voices of friends or comrades breaking under torture, and living with the certainty that they too would soon betray their companions. A survivor stated, "They didn't just break our bodies, they shattered our trust in ourselves and in others." The milice developed a vast network of informants that infiltrated all social strata. Anyone could be a traitor: the postman, the shopkeeper, the teacher, the doctor. This ever-present threat turned daily life into an exercise in constant vigilance, where even the most intimate confidences could be fatal. The propaganda machine significantly amplified the effect of physical terror. Philippe Henriot, Minister of Information and Propaganda of Vichy, used the radio to demonize the resistance as Judeo-Gaullist communist bandits and to justify any brutality as necessary to save the true France. His daily speeches, delivered with remarkable eloquence, had a considerable impact on a confused and fearful population. The collaboration between the milice and German forces produced some of the most tragic episodes of the occupation. While the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane was primarily carried out by the SS Das Reich Division, the milice provided crucial intelligence on suspected resistance ties within the village. On June 10, 1944, German troops surrounded the small Limousin town. The men were separated and executed by firing squad, while the women and children were locked inside the church, which was set on fire. The final toll: 642 civilians massacred. The town was left in ruins and later preserved as a monument to barbarism. The operation against the Maquis of Plateau d'Aiglières in March 1944 marked another key moment in this deadly collaboration. This high plateau in Haute-Savoie had become a refuge for hundreds of resistants escaping forced labor in Germany. After fierce battles, a joint German milice force crushed the resistance. Captured survivors were tortured, summarily executed or deported. Although the Vichy propaganda machine framed this as a victory over terrorist bands, the battle would later become a symbol of heroic resistance against occupation. The resistance, far from being intimidated by the Milice's growing brutality, responded with calculated violence. Unlike the Germans, who generally remained in garrisons, the militians lived among the civilian population, making them vulnerable. The resistance prioritized targeting key figures within the repressive apparatus, carefully avoiding collateral damage that could alienate public support. The most emblematic action was the assassination of Philippe Henriot. On June 28, 1944, a resistance commando infiltrated the Ministry of Information in Paris. Disguised as militians with an urgent message, they gained access to Henriot's quarters and shot him while he slept. His wife was intentionally left alive so she could recount the event, turning the psychological terror tactics of the milice against themselves. Henriot's death proved that not even the most protected figures of the regime were safe. The pattern of attack and counterattack reached a feverish intensity in the summer of 1944. In Lyon, a commando unit attacked a restaurant frequented by milice officers, killing 7. In Toulouse, the local chief was gunned down while walking with his family. Each action provoked an equally lethal response, in a cycle of violence that constantly escalated. The moral boundaries blurred on both sides with tactics that often mirrored those they sought to combat. Sabotage against milice infrastructure complemented direct attacks. Barracks were bombed, archives destroyed, vehicles sabotaged, communication lines cut. These actions not only inflicted material damage on the organization, but also undermined its operational capacity and its image of invulnerability. Particularly effective was the bombing of the central headquarters in Lyon, which destroyed crucial documents on informants and infiltrated operatives, potentially saving hundreds of lives. In rural areas, where the Maquis had established effective control, the offensive against the milice took on the characteristics of open warfare. Milice patrols were regularly ambushed on back roads, suffering casualties that were rarely made public to avoid demoralizing the rest of the organization. In response, they joined German troops in pacification operations against entire villages suspected of supporting the resistance. On August 20, 1944, with Lyon on the verge of liberation, the milice carried out one of its last and most desperate atrocities. In the forest of Saint-Genis-Laval, 120 political prisoners were systematically executed, their bodies doused in gasoline and burned. This massacre, carried out with full awareness of their imminent defeat, aimed to eliminate both witnesses and evidence of the crimes committed during the occupation. With the Allied advance after the Normandy landings, the milice's position became increasingly untenable. The fear of reprisals led to desertions and plummeting morale, although its most fanatical elements paradoxically intensified their brutality. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, marked the final collapse of the milice as an organized force. In the following weeks, as French cities were liberated one by one, an unforgiving reckoning began. Captured militians faced everything from summary trials to collective lynchings. The savage purge, épuration sauvage, that followed the liberation would claim thousands of lives, many of them former milice members, ushering in a new chapter of violence with its own moral and practical complexities. The collapse of the milice and the hunt for traitors. June 6, 1944, marked a decisive turning point in the history of World War II and the fate of the Milice Française. As the first Allied units landed on the beaches of Normandy in the most ambitious amphibious military operation ever undertaken, an inescapable countdown began for French collaborators. Operation Overlord was not only the beginning of the end for the German occupation, but also the prelude to an internal reckoning that would shake the very foundations of French society. The beaches with their code names, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, where American, British and Canadian forces landed, became a symbol of hope for most French citizens and a grim omen for those who had bet on a German victory. In Milice headquarters, news of the landing was received with a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed apprehension. Internal documents recovered after the war revealed the desperate attempts of the leadership to maintain morale, assuring their subordinates that the Anglo-American invasion would be repelled and that Germany's final victory was assured. However, private notes in officers' diaries show a more lucid understanding of the true implications. "If the Allies manage to establish a solid bridgehead, our fate will be sealed," wrote a commander in Lyon. "The population that fears us today will hate us without restraint tomorrow." The Allied advance from Normandy, gradual but relentless, began to systematically dismantle the power structures established over 4 years of occupation. The Milice, which had been the most feared instrument of internal repression, suddenly found itself vulnerable as Allied-controlled territory expanded. The German troops, prioritizing their own tactical survival, abandoned peripheral positions to concentrate on strategic strongholds, leaving their former French collaborators to fend for themselves. The landing in Provence, Operation Dragoon, on August 15th, opened a second front in the south, dramatically accelerating the collapse of the collaborationist system. France was now caught in a military pincer, which inexorably compressed the space controlled by Axis forces and their allies. At the same time, the Maquis, galvanized by the Allied advance and reinforced by parachuted weapons shipments, intensified their attacks against Milice strongholds in rural areas. The liberation of Paris between August 19th and 25th, achieved through a popular uprising supported by the 2nd Armored Division of General Leclerc, delivered the final blow to the legitimacy of the collaborationist regime. The images of jubilant Parisians celebrating in the streets, covering Allied soldiers and resistance fighters with flowers, starkly contrasted with the scenes that would soon follow: the relentless persecution of those identified as traitors to the nation. In these days of rapid collapse, the militians faced an inescapable reality. There was no longer a safe refuge for them in France. Their options were extremely limited, each carrying mortal risks. Immediate survival became the only imperative for thousands of men who just weeks earlier had exercised almost absolute power over their fellow citizens. Numerous militians attempted to flee to Germany, hoping to find protection among the retreating Reich forces. Columns of vehicles and groups on foot moved toward the eastern border, often disguised as civilians or using forged documents. Contemporary testimonies describe these exoduses as ghostly processions, men who had once patrolled arrogantly in uniform now crawling along back roads, avoiding attention, discarding any symbols that could identify them with their former affiliation. A Belgian refugee who witnessed these groups passing through the Vosges wrote in his diary, "It is both a pathetic and terrifying sight. Men who once inspired terror are now consumed by panic. They travel mostly at night like bands of ghosts. During the day they hide in barns and forests. Many carry hastily forged documents. The arrogance has vanished from their faces, replaced by a mixture of fear and despair." Some managed to reach German territory, where approximately 2,500 ex-militians joined the Charlemagne division of the Waffen-SS, a unit composed of French volunteers who would fight to the fall of Berlin, demonstrating an ideological loyalty that transcended military defeat. Many of these men perished in the last desperate battles to defend Hitler's bunker in April 1945, taking their commitment to the Nazi cause to the extreme. Those who survived were later repatriated to France to face trials for treason. Others chose the route to Spain, governed by the François regime, which had maintained a neutrality favorable to the Axis throughout the war. However, the Pyrenean crossing was fraught with dangers. The mountainous routes were largely controlled by Spanish Republican guerrillas, exiles from the Spanish Civil War who had found refuge and purpose in the French resistance. For a militian, being captured by these guerrillas was equivalent to an immediate death sentence, carried out with the extra vengeance that only civil wars can generate. A report from Allied intelligence, dated October 1944, estimated that about one-third of Milice members had attempted to flee the country, with a success rate of barely 20%. Most were captured while trying to escape, either by resistance forces, advancing Allied units, or civilians alert to the presence of strangers in their communities. The less notorious militians simply tried to disappear, blending into the civilian population in regions where they were unknown. They changed their names, altered their appearances, destroyed uniforms and compromising documents, and invented fictitious pasts. This strategy worked temporarily for some, although the arrival of an unfamiliar face in small rural communities during such tumultuous times inevitably aroused suspicion. Many were betrayed by observant neighbors or by former informants eager to align themselves with the new powers, displaying their sudden patriotism by turning in the very collaborators they had once aided. A documented case is that of Henri Lafont, a member of the Milice in Toulouse, who assumed the identity of a deceased distant cousin and settled as a baker in a village in Brittany. For 6 months, he managed to maintain his cover until a customer who had passed through Toulouse during the occupation recognized him. He was arrested that same night and executed after a summary trial. For the most prominent figures of the Milice, whose identities were widely known, the prospects were even darker. Some chose suicide rather than face popular justice or the courts. Paul de Gassovsky, commander of the Milice in Limoges, shot himself in the temple when his hiding place was discovered. Marcel Déat, an ideologue closely linked to the organization, unsuccessfully attempted suicide before fleeing to Italy, where he remained in hiding until his natural death in 1955. One of the few collaborationist leaders who permanently evaded justice. Most militians, however, did not escape retribution. They were captured by the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFI, the official designation adopted by the resistance after the landings, by regular Allied troops, or frequently by enraged civilians who spontaneously took on the role of executioners. What followed was one of the most controversial episodes in modern French history, the épuration sauvage, or wild purge, a period of summary justice where the line between legitimate accountability and unchecked revenge completely disappeared. In cities, towns, and villages across France, similar scenes unfolded. Captured militians and other collaborators were subjected to public humiliation, beatings, torture, and frequently execution without any judicial process. Women accused of horizontal collaboration, intimate relationships with Germans or militians, were especially mistreated. Their heads were publicly shaved, they were marked with painted swastikas, and paraded half-naked through hostile crowds in rituals of degradation that reflected both a desire for social purification and deeply ingrained gender prejudices. A British officer who witnessed one of these purification ceremonies in a small Norman town wrote, "It is a spectacle that reminds me more of the Middle Ages than the 20th century. The crowd seems possessed by a collective fury. Young women, some no older than 16, are dragged to the center of the square, where their heads are brutally shaved as the crowd chants insults. Then they are paraded through the streets with signs hanging around their necks. I cannot help but wonder if this justice is not as barbaric as the crimes it claims to punish." Contemporary testimonies describe the climate of revolutionary justice that permeated France during these turbulent months. A writer who witnessed the events in Grenoble recounted how the crowd seemed to transform, abandoning any trace of empathy. They were faces distorted by a primordial hatred, eyes bloodshot, mouths spewing curses. Men and women who, days earlier, had lowered their gaze before a milice uniform now clamored for blood, competing to deliver the cruelest blow. Lynchings took on a macabre ritual, especially in regions where the milice had been particularly brutal. In Lyon, a city that had housed its headquarters under the command of Paul Touvier, captured collaborators were often taken to the same building where the milice had tortured members of the resistance. There, they endured similar treatment before being executed, in a cycle of violent reciprocity that revealed how the oppressors' methods could be adopted by those they once oppressed. An American journalist who documented these acts wrote, "The most disturbing thing is not just the brutality of these improvised executions, but the festive air surrounding them. Entire families, including young children, attend as if it were a spectacle. I heard a mother explaining to her son, 'Look closely, this is how traitors end. It is a live history lesson, but I wonder what kind of lesson they are really learning.'" The improvised executions were not solely the work of uncontrolled mobs. In many localities, resistance units organized people's tribunals, where accused collaborators faced summary trials that almost always ended in death sentences. These trials lacked basic procedural guarantees and operated under the presumption of guilt, especially for identified milice members, considered traitors by definition. A resistant who participated in these tribunals in the Toulouse region later explained, "It was not a time for legal subtleties. We had seen too many atrocities, lost too many comrades. Every militian we captured had French blood on their hands. The question was not whether they deserved to die, but how they had managed to live so long. A widely documented case was that of the People's Tribunal established in Limoges, which tried 65 suspected collaborators in less than 2 weeks. Of these, 38 were sentenced to death and publicly executed. A neutral observer who attended several of these trials noted, "The outcome was predetermined. The audience in the room shouted insults and threats. Defense lawyers, when they dared to appear, were booed and intimidated. It was theatre, not justice." While this popular justice played out in the streets, the Provisional Government of the French Republic, established by de Gaulle, sought to restore the rule of law. On August 26, 1944, just one day after the liberation of Paris, de Gaulle signed an ordinance establishing special courts to prosecute acts of collaboration. This initiative reflected both an understanding of the legitimate thirst for justice and the fear that France could descend into uncontrollable violence, jeopardizing national reconstruction. In a speech delivered during those crucial days, de Gaulle expressed this delicate balance. Justice must be severe, but it must be justice. France cannot afford to imitate the methods it has so strongly condemned in its enemies. Our cause is the cause of law, and it will be in the name of the law that the traitors must answer for their actions. Despite these institutional calls for moderation, the purge continued with varying intensity for several months. Estimates of extrajudicial executions range from 8,000 to 15,000, depending on the sources, figures that reveal the magnitude of this reckoning. Thousands of additional collaborators were imprisoned in precarious conditions, awaiting formal trials that in many cases would take years to materialize. War correspondent Ernest Hemingway, who accompanied the Allied forces during the liberation of France, described the situation as the deadly hangover of 6 years of occupation and humiliation. In a letter to his editor, he wrote, "What is happening here is not simply a hunt for collaborators. It is a country exercising its demons, and the process is not pleasant to witness." For the militians who survived this initial wave of popular justice, the future remained bleak. Those captured by regular forces would eventually face more formal courts, but the social climate ensured that there would be no clemency for those who had actively collaborated with the occupier. Their public trials not only evaluated their individual actions, but also symbolized France judging itself after 4 years of occupation and complicity with the enemy. The épuration légale, or legal purge, that followed the initial phase of spontaneous justice remained severe, particularly toward milice members. French society, traumatized by years of occupation and collaboration, demanded exemplary punishments for those who had betrayed the nation. Judges and juries, many of them former resistants or individuals who had personally suffered under the repression, could hardly detach themselves from the overwhelming public demand for unambiguous justice. As France embarked on the arduous process of physical and moral reconstruction after the war, the divisions created by the occupation and exacerbated by the actions of the milice remained as deep wounds in the social fabric. Entire communities were fractured by memories of denunciation, betrayal, and revenge. In many villages, families with members on opposing sides continued to avoid each other for generations, silently perpetuating the fractures of those dark years. Historian Robert Aron, in his book History of the Liberation of France, published in 1959, concluded, "The hunt for the militian represented more than just the persecution of a specific group of collaborators. It was a desperate attempt by a nation to purify itself, to draw a clear line between victims and perpetrators, between resistance and traitors. But reality was far more complex. The line separating collaboration from resistance often ran through the same families, even through the same individuals who had navigated the dark years of the occupation as best they could. The collapse of the milice and the subsequent persecution of its members thus constituted a particularly painful chapter in France's transition from occupation to the restoration of its sovereignty. This period of reckoning revealed both the understandable desire for justice and the fragility of legal principles when a society has endured extreme trauma. The line between victims and executioners, often clear in theory, became blurred in the reality of a nation struggling to exorcise its inner demons. The final judgment, trials and executions of milice members, autumn 1944. With the restoration of Republican authority under de Gaulle's provisional government, The time had come to channel the thirst for justice through formal institutions that would restore the rule of law, a fundamental element in the moral reconstruction of the country. The épuration, or purge, was an attempt to morally rebuild a traumatized nation, evolving from the initial popular justice to the épuration légale, legal purge, a governmental effort to institutionalize the prosecution of collaborators within a recognizable legal framework. On August 26, 1944, de Gaulle signed an ordinance establishing special courts, the Cour de justice for serious cases and the Chambres civiques for minor offenses. These judicial bodies, composed of a professional judge and 4 jurors selected from among resistants and deportees, sought to channel collective anger into proceedings with a semblance of legal formality. The scale of the legal purge was extraordinary. Between 1944 and 1951, approximately 300,000 investigations for collaboration were opened. More than half were dismissed. Of the cases that went to trial, 6,763 people were sentenced to death, but only 791 of these executions were actually carried out, reflecting a gradual moderation that aimed to balance justice with national reconciliation. Milice members received particularly harsh treatment. Their active collaboration, participation in torture, and deliberate betrayal placed them among the most despised defendants in both public opinion and the courts. The blue milice uniform had become a symbol of treason. In Lyon, one of the most significant collective trials brought 28 members of the organization before the court. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of tortured victims, medical reports, and survivor testimonies. 18 defendants were sentenced to death and executed at La Duchère fortress. The method of execution carried a particular symbolism, firing squads for traitors, while the guillotine was reserved for common criminals. This distinction indicated that the firing squad corresponded to martial justice, considered appropriate for punishing treason against the nation. Executions followed a strict protocol. At dawn, the condemned was led to a prison courtyard or military firing range. They were offered a final cigarette and given the option of a blindfold. A 12-man firing squad, with 6 live bullets and 6 blanks, stood 20 paces away, ensuring that no shooter knew for certain if they had delivered the fatal shot. Although the legal purge sought to adhere to formal procedures, parallel justice mechanisms persisted. In Dijon, one episode illustrated this tension. Jacques Lassac, a former police chief, was acquitted on legal technicalities. The news sparked public outrage. A mob stormed the prison, kidnapped him, and hanged him on the outskirts of the city. Among the most emblematic cases were the trials of top collaborationist leaders. Jacques Doriot never faced justice, as his car was strafed by an Allied aircraft in February 1945. Philippe Henriot, assassinated by the resistance in June 1944, was also never brought to trial. Joseph Darnand, founder and leader of the Milice, was formally tried after being captured in Italy and extradited to France. His trial drew national attention. Although he did not deny his role in the Milice or his oath to Hitler, he insisted that he had acted out of patriotism and anti-communism. This defense was met with hostility, especially from an audience that included survivors of torture and families of executed resistance. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all charges, sentenced to death. On October 10, 1945, Darnand was executed by firing squad at Fort de Châtillon. His last words, "I die for France and for Europe," revealed his unwavering ideological conviction until the end. Paul Touvier, head of the Milice in Lyon, managed to evade immediate justice, hiding for years in convents, protected by traditionalist sectors of the Catholic Church. Sentenced to death in absentia in 1946, he remained a fugitive until 1989. His trial in 1994 made him the first Frenchman convicted of crimes against humanity. The collective dimension of the purge was also reflected in indignité nationale, national indignity. Approximately 49,723 people were sentenced to this penalty, which entailed the loss of civil and political rights. This civil death, more than prison sentences, proved to be the most enduring punishment for many minor collaborators, affecting not only the condemned but their entire families. The implementation of the purge was not uniform. In regions where the resistance had been most active or where the milice had committed notorious atrocities, the trials tended to be more severe. In conservative rural areas, courts showed relative leniency. As France moved toward post-war stability and the Cold War tensions emerged, the punitive momentum weakened. The 1951 amnesty, expanded in 1953, allowed thousands of those convicted of minor collaboration to return to public life. By 1964, virtually all collaboration-related sentences, except for the most serious cases, had been pardoned. Historian Henry Rousseau later remarked, "The purge was not so much a judicial process as a ritual of collective purification, an exorcism of the demons of Vichy and collaboration. If it was imperfect, it was because French society itself remained deeply divided over how to interpret and process its recent past." Memory and controversy, the shadow of the Milice in French history. Paris, 1994. Half a century after the liberation, a 79-year-old man appears before a court accused of crimes against humanity. Paul Touvier, former regional chief of the Milice in Lyon, had spent decades in hiding, protected by clandestine networks and traditionalist factions of the Catholic Church. His trial, broadcast on television, abruptly brought back to national consciousness a past that many preferred to forget. This late case illustrates one of the deepest paradoxes in France's relationship with its recent history: the simultaneous need to remember and to forget, to confront the past and move beyond it. This constant tension has shaped the way French society has processed the legacy of the Milice, perhaps the most disturbing symbol of collaboration during the Nazi occupation. France developed what historian Henry Rousseau called the Vichy syndrome, an ambivalent relationship with the memory of the occupation, characterized by cycles of repression and obsession, of official silence and persistent trauma. The Milice, as the most extreme form of active collaboration, occupied a particularly uncomfortable place in this wounded memory. The first official response was the construction of the resistentialist myth, a simplified narrative that portrayed France as a nation of resistors, with only a handful of traitorous collaborators. This myth, promoted by de Gaulle's government, aimed to restore national unity after the humiliation of defeat and occupation. In his August 25, 1944, speech during the liberation of Paris, de Gaulle established this narrative: Paris liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies, with the support of all France, of the France that fights, of the only France, of the true France, of eternal France. This rhetoric deliberately downplayed collaboration and magnified resistance. Within this storyline, the Milice was reduced to a marginal group of fanatics, an aberration detached from the national character. Collaboration was presented as a temporary deviation caused by exceptional circumstances, rather than as a phenomenon rooted in pre-existing political movements. This narrative allowed many French citizens to avoid the painful process of collective self-examination that would have required questioning why so many accepted the Vichy regime, what collective responsibility France bore in the persecution of Jews and political opponents, and what tendencies within French society had allowed the emergence of organizations like the Milice. Official memory policies consistently favored reconciliation over recrimination. The 1951 and 1953 amnesties allowed many minor collaborators to reintegrate, while educational curricula emphasized the heroic aspects of the resistance, relegating collaboration to a marginal note. History textbooks barely mentioned the Milice, and when they did, they portrayed it as an isolated group without connections to pre-war political currents. This selective amnesia was neither accidental nor arbitrary. It responded to concrete political needs. France needed internal stability to face reconstruction and the new international order of the Cold War. The anti-communist fervor that had motivated many militians now became politically useful in the context of East-West tensions. However, beneath this apparent willingness to forget, unresolved currents of memory persisted. For the families of Milice victims, for torture survivors, and for communities that had suffered reprisals, the amnesties and normalization of former collaborators represented a painful denial of their suffering. This silence began to break in the 1970s, when a new generation, without direct memories of the war, started to question the official narrative. The documentary Le Chagrin et la Pitié, 1969, by Marcel Ophuls, although not broadcast on French television until 1981 due to official pressure, was a turning point. It revealed the true extent of collaboration and included frank testimonies from former collaborators. Historian Robert Paxton, with his work Vichy France, 1972, introduced academic rigor to this historical revision, meticulously documenting that the Milice emerged as a French initiative within the logic of the Vichy regime, not as a German imposition. This perspective directly challenged the myth that collaboration had been forced or merely pragmatic. These works opened the floodgates for new research, memoirs, and literature that explored the grey areas of occupation history. The Milice, once relegated to the periphery of official memory, returned to the centre of the debate on France's past. The Touvier case was particularly revealing. His trial exposed not only his crimes as head of the Milice in Lyon, including the execution of 7 Jews in Rieux-la-Pape, but also the extensive network of protection that allowed him to remain hidden for decades. Even more disturbing was the revelation that in 1971, President Georges Pompidou had secretly pardoned him, forcing France to confront its sincerity in addressing historical justice. The testimony of Isaac Vadnai, a survivor of the Rieux-la-Pape executions, captured what was at stake. "I am not here for revenge. 50 years have passed. I am here for the truth, so that my grandchildren know that justice, though delayed, eventually arrives, so that France acknowledges what happened, not as an aberrant exception, but as part of its history." The debate over the nature of the épuration sauvage continues to divide historians. For some, these extrajudicial executions were a comprehensible form of popular justice in the absence of functioning institutions. For others, they merely perpetuated the very practices condemned in the enemy. The escape of numerous militians to countries such as Spain, Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile adds another layer to this history. Using the same routes as Nazi war criminals, prominent Milice figures managed to evade French justice, often with the complicity of religious networks and international conservative political groups. René Pleven, a high-ranking Milice officer in Bordeaux, illustrates this phenomenon. He escaped to Argentina in 1946 using forged documents, adopted the name René Martin, and established a prosperous business in Buenos Aires. He was only identified in 1983 when a French tourist, the son of one of his victims, recognized him by chance in a restaurant. The speech by President Jacques Chirac on July 16, 1995, officially acknowledging the responsibility of the French state in the deportation of Jews, marked a turning point. Although it did not specifically mention the Milice, his recognition that those dark days forever stain our history represented an explicit rejection of the resistentialist myth. In the cultural sphere, the Milice has inspired works that explore the moral complexities of collaboration. Films such as La Combe Lucien, 1974, and Au revoir les enfants, 1987, by Louis Malle, or Army of Crime, 2009, by Robert Guédiguian, offer nuanced portrayals that contrast with earlier simplifications. The novel La Ronde de Nuit, 1969, by Patrick Modiano, delves into the moral atmosphere of the occupation, exploring those grey areas where misguided idealism, opportunism, and coercion coexisted. Although it does not specifically address the Milice, Modiano's work has been crucial in understanding the moral complexity of that period. For the families of Milice members, the legacy remains particularly difficult. Many descendants have grown up under oppressive silence, with half-revealed family secrets, unable to reconcile themselves with the past of their parents or grandparents. Others have embarked on painful personal investigations, trying to understand without justifying. The debate over the historical significance of the Milice remains open. For some historians, it represents an extreme but revealing case of authoritarian, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic tendencies that existed in pre-war French society. For others, it was primarily a product of extraordinary circumstances, without deep roots in French political culture. What is undeniable is that the Milice raises fundamental questions about loyalty, obedience, and moral resistance in times of crisis. As sociologist Michel Vieviorca suggests, the Milice unsettles us because it reminds us that under certain circumstances, ordinary citizens can become executioners of their compatriots. The persistence of the Milice in French collective memory despite initial attempts to minimize or forget its existence, demonstrates that no society can build a solid future without confronting the darkest pages of its history.